My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 28 years old. And until 3 weeks ago, I thought I knew everything about my family. I was wrong. Devastatingly, earth-shatteringly wrong. The revelation came in the most ordinary way possible, well, cleaning out my deceased grandmother's attic, but it changed everything I believed about my identity, my parents, and the foundation of my entire existence. I'm writing this because I need to make sense of what happened, need to process the betrayal that cuts so deep it feels like drowning in quicksand made of lies. The woman I called Grandma Rose had been gone for 2 months when we finally gathered. The courage to tackle her house. My mother, Elizabeth, had been putting off the inevitable, claiming she wasn't ready emotionally. Looking back now, I understand her reluctance wasn't about grief, it was about fear. Fear that her carefully constructed world of deception would finally crumble. The day started innocently enough. Mom, Dad, and I drove to the old Victorian house where I'd spent countless childhood summers, where Rose had baked me cookies and told me stories about our family's proud Irish heritage. The familiar scent of lavender and old wood greeted us as we climbed the creaking stairs to the dusty attic. Sunlight streamed through a small window, illuminating particles of dust dancing in the air like tiny ghosts of memories. We worked in comfortable silence initially, sorting through boxes of photographs, vintage clothes, and mementos from a life fully lived. I was handling a box of what appeared to be old letters when the bottom gave way, spilling its contents across the wooden floor. Among the scattered papers was a manila envelope marked with my name and Rose's distinctive handwriting. My heart skipped as I opened it, expecting perhaps a letter she'd written before her passing. Instead, I found documents that would destroy everything I thought I knew about myself. The first document I pulled out was a birth certificate. My birth certificate, but something was wrong. The names listed as parents weren't Elizabeth and Robert Mitchell. They were complete strangers, Maria Santos and James Rodriguez. My hands trembled as I stared at the official seal, the dates that matched my birthday exactly, the hospital where I was supposedly born. This had to be some mistake, some cruel joke. I looked up to find my parents frozen in the dim attic light, their faces drained of color. Mom's mouth was slightly open, as if she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Dad had gone completely. Still, a box of Rose's jewelry clutched in his white-knuckled grip. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap. When I finally found my voice, it came out as barely a whisper. "What is this?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Mom sank to her knees on the dusty floor, tears already streaming down her cheeks. In that moment, I watched my entire childhood reframe itself in real time. The way other kids sometimes said I didn't look like my parents. The absence of baby photos from my first few months of life. The vague stories about my difficult birth that always seemed to change in small details. All those little inconsistencies I dismissed now blazed like warning signals I'd been too trusting to see. Dad finally set down the jewelry box and moved toward me, his weathered hands reaching out as if to comfort me, but I instinctively stepped back. How could the hands that had taught me to ride a bicycle, that had wiped away my tears, that had applauded at every school play, belong to someone who had built our entire relationship on a foundation of lies? The betrayal felt physical, like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it could barely beat. "Sarah, sweetheart, please let us explain." Dad's voice was thick with emotion I'd never heard before, a desperate quality that made him sound like a stranger. But I wasn't ready for explanations. I was too busy drowning in questions that crashed over me like waves. Who was I really? Where did I come from? Were Maria Santos and James Rodriguez still alive? Did I have siblings I'd never met? What other lies had shaped my existence? I sank to the floor myself, clutching the birth certificate so tightly the edges began to crumple. The woman I called Mom Elizabeth was sobbing now, her whole body shaking with the kind of grief that comes from watching something precious break beyond repair. "We were going to tell you," she managed between gasps. "Rose made us promise we'd tell you when you turned 30. She said you'd be mature enough then to understand." The words felt like acid in my ears. 30? They were planning to let me live in ignorance for 2 more years? How many more birthdays, holidays, family gatherings would have passed with this massive secret sitting between us like an uninvited guest? I thought about all the forms I'd filled out over the years, medical histories I'd provided to doctors, genetic information I'd confidently shared, all based on complete fabrications. The rage began to build slowly, starting as a warm flush in my cheeks and spreading through my body like wildfire. Understand what, exactly? My voice was getting stronger now, fueled by anger that felt safer than the crushing vulnerability of betrayal. Understand that my entire life has been a lie, that every story about our family, every tradition we've shared, every connection I thought I had to you was built on deception. Mom looked up at me with eyes red and swollen, and for a moment I saw not the woman who had raised me, but a stranger wearing her face. "You're our daughter," she said fiercely. "Biology doesn't change that, but biology did change things, everything in fact." I stood up abruptly, needing space between myself and these people who suddenly felt like actors in a play I'd unknowingly been performing in for 28 years. The attic seemed smaller now, the air thicker, as if the weight of revealed truth was pressing down on all of us. I found more documents in the envelope adoption papers, legal agreements, correspondence between my parents and some kind of agency. Each piece of paper was another nail in the coffin of my former identity. According to the documents, I'd been adopted at 3 months old through a private arrangement. My birth parents had been teenagers, unmarried, unable to care for a child. The agency had deemed Elizabeth and Robert Mitchell suitable parents after extensive background checks and interviews. Everything had been legal, proper, official. Everything, except the part where they told me. I learned that Rose had opposed keeping it secret from the beginning. There were letters from her to my parents expressing her concerns about the deception, arguing that I deserved to know the truth. She'd been overruled by Elizabeth and Robert, who believed that ignorance would protect me from feelings of abandonment and confusion. They thought love would be enough, that blood didn't matter if the bond was strong. They were wrong on both counts. Love built on lies isn't really love, it's manipulation disguised as protection. And blood did matter, not because it made someone more or less family, but because denying its existence had robbed me of the choice to understand myself completely. I thought about Maria Santos and James Rodriguez, 2 teenagers who'd made an impossible decision decades ago. Did they wonder about me? Did they regret giving me up? Were they somewhere in the world, perhaps with families of their own now, carrying their own secrets about a daughter they'd never known? The questions multiplied like bacteria, each one breeding more uncertainty. The worst part was realizing how many people had been complicit in this deception. It wasn't just Elizabeth and Robert, it was Rose, who'd kept the secret until her death despite her reservations. It was probably other family members, family friends, people in our community who had known me since childhood and never said a word. I began to understand why certain relatives had always seemed slightly distant with me, why some family gatherings had included whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room. How many people had looked at me over the years and known something I didn't know about myself? The sense of violation was overwhelming. I stumbled toward the attic stairs, desperate for fresh air and space to think. Behind me, I could hear Elizabeth calling my name, her voice breaking with each syllable. But I couldn't turn back, couldn't face them yet. The stairs creaked under my feet as I descended, each step taking me further from the people I'd called. Parents and deeper into a version of myself I didn't recognize. Outside, I sat in my car for what felt like hours, staring at the birth certificate until the words blurred together. Maria Santos, James Rodriguez. These names should have meant everything to me, but instead they felt like words in a foreign language. I tried to picture them, these phantom parents who'd given me life but not love, who'd made the decision that led to this moment of complete displacement. Were they heroes for recognizing they couldn't provide what I needed? Were they cowards for walking away? Were they victims of circumstances beyond their control? I realized I was crying when a tear fell onto the document, smudging the ink slightly. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was literally watching my identity dissolve under the weight of my own grief. My phone buzzed with text messages from Elizabeth and Robert pleading with me to come back inside, to let them explain properly, to not let this revelation destroy our family. But what family? The family built on truth or the family built on comfortable lies? I started the car and drove aimlessly through neighborhoods I'd known since childhood, seeing them with new eyes. Every landmark held different meaning now. The elementary school where I'd attended plays and science fairs had other parents there known my secret. The church where we'd attended services for years had the pastor who'd watched me grow up known I wasn't really a Mitchell by birth. The ice cream shop where Dad had taken me every Friday after school had those moments of connection been tainted by his knowledge of what he was hiding from me. I found myself driving toward the cemetery where Rose was buried, needing somehow to confront the woman who'd taken the secret to her grave. The sun was setting as I walked among the headstones, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the darkness spreading through my understanding of my own life. Rose's grave was still, fresh, marked with flowers that Elizabeth had probably placed there the week before. Standing there, I felt a complex mixture of love and betrayal toward this woman who'd been my confidant, my source of family stories and traditions, my connection to what I'd believed was my heritage. She'd held my hand through scraped knees and broken hearts, taught me to bake bread and embroider pillowcases, shared stories of our ancestors that were apparently complete fiction as far as my bloodline was concerned. Had she felt guilty every time she looked at me? Had she struggled with the weight of keeping this secret? Or had it become so natural over the years that she'd almost forgotten it was a lie? I knelt beside her headstone and spoke aloud for the first time since discovering the truth. Why didn't you tell me yourself, Grandma? Why did you let me find out like this? The only answer was the sound of wind through the cemetery trees, rustling leaves that seemed to whisper secrets I'd never be able to hear. That night, I stayed in a hotel, rather than returning to my apartment, which suddenly felt like another space contaminated by lies. I needed neutral ground to process what I'd learned, somewhere that held no memories of the family that now felt like strangers wearing familiar faces. I spread the documents across the hotel bed and studied them like evidence in a crime scene, which in some ways they were. The crime was the theft of my right to know myself completely. I called in sick to work the next day, unable to imagine sitting through meetings and pretending everything was normal when my entire foundation had cracked. Instead, I began researching. I Googled Maria Santos and James Rodriguez, though the names were so common that the search yielded thousands of results. I tried different combinations with my birth year, the hospital where I was born, the city where the adoption had been arranged. Most leads went nowhere, but I did find some possibilities. Maria Santos, who would be about 46 now, living 2 states away, with a Facebook profile that showed a woman with dark eyes that looked disturbingly familiar in the mirror. Could this be her? Could this stranger be the woman who'd carried me for 9 months? who'd felt me move inside her, who'd held me for the first 3 months of my life before making the decision that led me to Elizabeth and Robert. The thought of reaching out terrified me. What would I say? Hello, I think you might be my biological mother. What if she'd moved on completely, built a life that had no room for the daughter she'd given away? What if she didn't want to be found? But equally terrifying was the possibility of never knowing, of spending the rest of my life wondering about these shadow parents who'd shaped my existence through their absence. I created fake social media accounts and began carefully investigating the people I thought might be connected to my birth family. Each profile I viewed felt like an invasion of privacy, but also like an attempt to solve the mystery of my own identity. Elizabeth called constantly over the following days, leaving voicemails that progressed from apologetic to desperate to angry and back to heartbroken. "You're still our daughter," she kept saying, as if repetition could make it feel true again. Nothing has changed except what you know, but everything had changed. The way I saw my reflection in the mirror, wondering which features came from Maria and which from James. The way I questioned every aspect of my personality, wondering what was nature versus nurture. The way I felt like an imposter in my own life, playing a role I'd never consciously auditioned for. Robert left fewer messages, but when he did speak, his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "I know you're angry," he said in one voicemail. "I know you feel betrayed. But Sarah, sweetheart, you have to understand, we were young and desperate to be parents. We'd tried for years to have children naturally. We'd suffered through multiple miscarriages. When the agency called and said there was a baby girl who needed a family, it felt like a miracle. We fell in love with you before we ever saw you, just from knowing you existed and needed us." His words painted a picture I'd never known my parents as heartbroken people who'd struggled with infertility, who'd seen me as an answer to prayers rather than just a child to raise. It added complexity to my anger, making it harder to maintain the pure fury that felt safer than the complicated grief of understanding their perspective. I began to realize that this secret had probably caused them pain too. Living with deception, even well-intentioned deception, creates its own burden. They'd had to remember which stories were true and which were fabricated. They'd had to deflect questions about my baby pictures, my birth story, my resemblance to relatives. They'd had to watch me fill out medical forms with false information and say nothing. Every milestone in my life had probably been tinged with the knowledge that they were building our relationship on an unstable foundation. After a week of isolation and research, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Elizabeth and asked her to meet me for coffee. Not Robert, just her. There were questions only a mother could answer, even if the definition of motherhood had become complicated. We met at a neutral location, a small cafe neither of us had been to before. Elizabeth looked like she'd aged years in the past week. Her usually neat hair was slightly unkempt, her eyes were swollen from crying, and she seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of revealed truth. She ordered tea with shaking hands and waited for me to speak first. "Tell me about the day you brought me home," I said finally. It was the one story I'd never heard, the one piece of my history that had been completely erased. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, but she began to speak. "You were the most beautiful baby I'd ever seen," she said. "So tiny, but so alert. You looked right at me when I held you, like you were studying my face. The social worker said you'd been fussy with the foster family, but you calmed down immediately when I picked you up. Robert joked that you'd chosen us as much as we'd chosen you." She told me about the first night, how they'd barely slept because they kept checking to make sure I was breathing. About the first time I smiled, the first time I laughed, the first words I spoke. These memories were real, she insisted. The love was real. The family we built was real, even if its foundation was more complicated than I'd known. But why keep it secret? I asked. Why not tell me from the beginning that I was adopted but loved? Elizabeth stirred her tea nervously. We were afraid, she admitted. Afraid you'd love us less. Afraid you'd want to find your birth parents and leave us behind. Afraid that knowing you weren't biologically ours would make you feel like you didn't really belong. The irony was bitter. Their fear of me feeling like I didn't belong had ultimately created exactly that feeling, but magnified by betrayal. Did you ever try to contact them? I asked. Maria and James? Elizabeth shook her head. The adoption was closed. We knew their names from the paperwork, but we were told they didn't want any contact. The agency said they wanted a clean break, wanted to move on with their lives. I absorbed this information, wondering how accurate it was. Had Maria and James really wanted no contact, or was that just what the agency had told Elizabeth and Robert? How much of my adoption story was filtered through intermediaries, who might have had their own motivations for keeping birth families and adoptive families separate? I need to find them, I said. I need to understand where I came from. Elizabeth's face crumpled. I was afraid you'd say that. It doesn't mean I'm rejecting you, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. It means I need to know the whole story of who I am. We talked for 2 hours, with Elizabeth sharing details she'd never told me before. About the home visits from social workers, about the legal proceedings that finalized the adoption, about the first few months when she'd been terrified that someone would change their mind and take me away. I began to understand that she'd been living with fear from the beginning, fear of losing me in different ways at different times. First fear that the adoption wouldn't go through, then fear that I'd discover the truth and reject her. Now fear that finding my birth parents would mean losing me to another family entirely. Her fears weren't entirely irrational. I was angry with her, felt betrayed by her, wasn't sure if I could trust her again. But I was also beginning to understand that she'd acted out of love, however misguided. The deception had been meant to protect me from feeling rejected or confused, even though it had ultimately created those exact feelings amplified by betrayal. As we prepared to leave the cafe, Elizabeth asked, "What happens now?" I honestly didn't know. I was caught between two identities: Sarah Mitchell, the daughter of Elizabeth and Robert, and Sarah Santos Rodriguez, the daughter of Maria and James. Neither felt completely real anymore. I hired a private investigator specializing in adoption reunions. Janet Morrison was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a matter-of-fact approach to what she called the most emotionally complex work in the world. She reviewed my documents and explained the process of searching for birth parents, including the possibility that they might not want to be found. Some birth parents spend decades hoping their children will find them, she said. Others have moved on completely and prefer not to revisit that chapter of their lives. We won't know which category yours fall into until we locate them. Within 2 weeks, Janet had found Maria Santos living in Colorado with a husband and 2 teenage children. She'd kept her maiden name professionally, but was now Maria Santos Williams. She worked as a nurse at a children's hospital, which felt like meaningful information. Somehow she'd dedicated her career to caring for children even after giving one away. Janet had also located James Rodriguez in Texas, where he was married, with 3 children, and owned a small construction business. They both built lives that moved forward from the decision they'd made as teenagers. But whether those lives had room for the daughter they'd placed for adoption remained to be seen. "I'll make contact," Janet explained. "I'll let them know that their daughter is searching for them, that she'd like some form of communication if they're open to it. I'll make it clear there's no pressure, no expectations beyond the possibility of answering some questions." The waiting was excruciating. Every day I checked my email obsessively, hoping for word from Janet about whether my birth parents were willing to have contact. I imagined countless scenarios, tearful reunions, complete rejection, awkward meetings where we discovered we had nothing in common beyond genetics. Meanwhile, my relationship with Elizabeth and Robert remained strained. We'd had several more conversations, each one slightly less emotionally charged than the last, but I still felt like I was looking at them through a lens of deception. Every shared memory now came with the question of what else they might have. Hidden from me, the call from Janet came on a Tuesday afternoon. "I have news," she said, and something in her tone told me it was complicated news. "I've heard back from both of your birth parents." Maria, it turned out, had been hoping for this contact for years. She'd thought about me constantly, wondered how I'd grown up, whether I was happy and healthy. She'd even hired her own investigator a few years earlier, but had stopped short of making contact because she wasn't sure if it would be welcome. She wanted to meet me, wanted to answer any questions I had, wanted to be part of my life in whatever way felt comfortable. James's response was different. He acknowledged that I was his biological daughter, but explained that reaching out would complicate his current family situation. His wife knew about me, but his children didn't. He was concerned that contact with me would disrupt the life he'd built and potentially cause problems in his marriage. He wished me well, but preferred to keep the past in the past. The contrasting responses hit me like a physical blow. One birth parent desperately wanted to know me, while the other wanted to keep me safely in the past where I couldn't complicate his present. It was rejection and acceptance simultaneously, leaving me emotionally whiplashed. Janet arranged a phone call with Maria for the following weekend. I spent the week preparing, writing down questions I wanted to ask, trying to imagine what her voice would sound like, wondering if we'd have anything in common beyond the genetic material we shared. When Saturday came, I was so nervous I could barely hold the phone steady. "Sarah?" Maria's voice was soft, slightly accented, warm with emotion I could hear even through the electronic connection. "Yes," I managed. "It's me." "Oh, honey," she said, and I could hear her crying. "I've been waiting for this call for 28 years. We talked for 3 hours that first time." Maria told me about the circumstances of my birth. She'd been 17, James 18, both from families who couldn't support a teenage pregnancy. The decision to place me for adoption had been heartbreaking, but felt necessary for everyone involved, including me. Maria shared photos via email after our first conversation, pictures of herself as a teenager that showed a girl with my eyes and smile, photos of her current family, images that filled in pieces of my genetic puzzle I'd been missing my entire life. Her daughter Emma was 15 and looked remarkably like me at that age. Her son Carlos was 13 and had James's darker coloring. Seeing these half-siblings I'd never known existed was surreal. I showed the photos to Elizabeth during one of our tentative reconciliation meetings. She studied them with an expression I couldn't read, probably seeing in them confirmation of her worst fears that I came from somewhere else, belonged to other people, had a whole identity that existed completely separate from the life she'd built with me. "They look like you," she said quietly, and I could hear the pain in her voice. "Emma, especially. Does that make you feel like less of my mother?" I asked. Elizabeth considered the question seriously. "It makes me feel like I was borrowing something precious that was never really mine to keep," she said. "But it also makes me grateful that I got to be your mom for 28 years, even if I don't get to be your only family anymore." Her honesty was both heartbreaking and healing. I began to understand that this revelation was changing her. Identity too, from my mother to my adoptive mother, from the woman who gave me life to the woman who raised me. The distinction mattered, even though the love was equally real in both relationships. I arranged to meet Maria in person, flying to Colorado for a weekend that felt like stepping into an alternate version of my life. She met me at the airport, holding a sign with my name. Though we would have recognized each other instantly, the genetic resemblance was unmistakable. The hug we shared felt both foreign and familiar, like embracing a stranger who happened to live in a body very similar to my own. Maria's husband, David, was welcoming, but clearly nervous about how this reunion might affect their family dynamics. Emma and Carlos were curious about their older half-sister, but uncertain how to relate to me. I was simultaneously family and stranger, connected by blood, but separated by a lifetime of different experiences. The weekend with Maria's family was emotionally exhausting, but illuminating. I learned about genetic predispositions that explained some of my health quirks. My sensitivity to certain medications came from Maria's side. My tendency toward anxiety from James's family history. I discovered cultural connections. I'd never known Maria's family was Mexican-American, which explained some physical features that had never quite made sense in the context of the Irish heritage Elizabeth and Robert had claimed. More importantly, I began to understand the circumstances that had led to my adoption. Maria showed me journal entries from when she was pregnant, letters she'd written to me that she'd never sent, photos from the hospital after I was born. She'd wanted to keep me desperately, but had known she couldn't provide what I needed. Her own mother had been unsupportive. James's family had pressured them to give me up, and they'd both been facing futures that didn't have room for a baby. "I held you for 3 days," she told me. "The longest 3 days of my life. I memorized your face, your tiny hands, the way you wrinkled your nose when you were sleeping. I wanted to remember every detail because I thought I might never see you again." The pain in her voice was raw, even after 28 years. I realized that my adoption had created loss for multiple people. Maria had lost a daughter. James had lost a child. Elizabeth and Robert had lost the fantasy of having a biological child, and I had lost the chance to know my origins from the beginning. We were all casualties of circumstances that had no perfect solutions. I also learned about James from Maria's perspective. He'd struggled with the decision more than I'd expected, had wanted to stay in contact with me somehow, but had been advised against it by lawyers and social workers who believed clean breaks were healthier for everyone involved. Maria had kept track of him over the years and said he'd often asked about me, wondered how I turned out, whether I was happy, flying back home after that weekend. I felt like I was carrying pieces of multiple identities that didn't quite fit together yet. I was Sarah Mitchell, raised by loving adoptive parents who'd made mistakes in their desire to protect me. I was also Sarah Santos Rodriguez, daughter of teenage parents who'd made an impossible decision out of love and necessity. I was a sister to Emma and Carlos, whom I barely knew but felt connected to through shared genetics and similar mannerisms. I was a half-sister to James's other children, who didn't even know I existed. Over the following months, I worked on rebuilding relationships with Elizabeth and Robert while developing a new relationship with Maria and her family. It was complicated, messy, sometimes painful work. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed by having too much family, and other moments when I felt like I didn't fully belong anywhere. Elizabeth struggled with jealousy when I talked about time spent with Maria, though she tried to hide it. Maria sometimes seemed to want more intimacy than I was ready to provide, having idealized our reunion in ways that reality couldn't match. Robert tried to be supportive, but clearly felt displaced by the addition of other father figures in my expanded family narrative. Through it all, I began to understand that identity isn't just about biology or about the family that raises you. It's about the choices you make in integrating all the pieces of yourself into something coherent and authentic. I chose to maintain relationships with both families while being honest about the complexity of my feelings. I chose to forgive Elizabeth and Robert for their deception while also setting boundaries about honesty moving forward. I chose to develop a relationship with Maria while being clear about my expectations and limitations. Most importantly, I chose to see my story not as a tragedy of lies and loss, but as a complex narrative of love expressed in different ways by different people at different times. James eventually reached out directly, 6 months after my initial contact through Janet. His marriage had gone through some difficulties unrelated to me, and during counseling, his therapist had suggested that integrating hidden parts of his past might be important for his emotional health. We met for coffee in a neutral city between our homes, and I finally got to see the man whose genes had contributed to my existence. He was nervous, apologetic, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but trying to do what he thought was right. "I want you to know that giving you up was never about not wanting you," he said. "It was about knowing we couldn't give you what you deserved at that time in our lives. Looking at you now, I can see that Elizabeth and Robert did a beautiful job raising you." It wasn't the emotional reunion I'd had with Maria, but it was closure of a different kind. James answered my questions about family medical history, shared a few photos from when he and Maria were young, and gave me contact information in case I ever needed anything in the future. He also promised to tell his children about me when he felt they were old enough to understand the complexity of the situation. By my 29th birthday, I had a strange but functional extended family that included adoptive parents who'd lied to protect me, a birth mother who'd spent decades hoping to know me again, a birth father who was cautiously open to limited contact, and half-siblings in multiple states who were slowly getting to know their older sister. It wasn't the simple family narrative I'd grown up believing, but it was richer and more honest than what I'd had before. The shocking secret my family kept from me had initially felt like a betrayal that destroyed everything I thought I knew about myself. In the end, it became the key to understanding that identity is not a single story, but a collection of stories, relationships, choices, and experiences that can expand and deepen throughout our lives. I am Sarah Mitchell and Sarah Santos Rodriguez. I am the daughter of parents who raised me and parents who gave me life. I am the product of love expressed through sacrifice and love expressed through daily presence. And finally, for the first time in my life, I know exactly who I am.